The river roared like a living beast beneath Katherine Zimmerman's feet, the makeshift raft spinning wildly as the ropes snapped with a sound like gunfire. One moment she stood terrified but stable. The next she was airborne, then plunged into the churning waters of the Rio Grande with a scream that was instantly swallowed by the current. Brock Parsons saw it happen from the riverbank, his stallion's reins still gripped in one hand, as he watched the young woman's desperate struggle against the powerful spring current. He didn't hesitate. Tossing his hat aside and shrugging off his leather vest, he dove into the frigid waters, powerful strokes cutting through the churning river toward the flash of blue calico disappearing beneath the surface. It was May of 1875, and neither of them had expected their lives to change forever at this dangerous river crossing outside of Julian, California. Katherine had been traveling west with a small wagon train of settlers, most heading to new opportunities in San Diego. The winter rains had swollen the river, making the crossing treacherous. The wagon master had insisted they attempt the crossing anyway, eager to make up for lost time. Katherine's wagon had been the third to attempt the passage. As the icy water filled her lungs, Katherine felt her consciousness slipping. The heavy fabric of her dress pulled her downward, the current tumbling her helplessly. Just as darkness closed in, strong arms encircled her waist, pulling upward with determined force. Breaking the surface, Brock gasped for air, one arm locked around the woman's slender form. "I've got you," he managed between breaths, though he doubted she could hear him. Her head lolled against his shoulder, dark hair plastered to her pale face. The current was relentless, dragging them downstream as Brock fought to angle them toward the shore. His muscles burned with the effort, his boots occasionally scraping the rocky riverbed when the waters briefly shallowed, only to be swept away again. Each time he managed to get her face above water, taking the brunt of the river's fury himself. After what seemed an eternity, his feet found purchase on the sloping riverbank. Stumbling and half-crawling, he dragged Katherine onto the muddy shore, collapsing beside her for only a moment before rolling her onto her side. "Breathe, miss," he urged, pushing the sodden hair from her face. When she remained still, panic surged through him. Without thinking, he turned her onto her back, tilted her head, and pressed his mouth to hers, forcing air into her lungs as he'd once seen a Mexican vaquero do for a drowned boy. Katherine's body convulsed suddenly, water spewing from her mouth as she gasped and coughed violently. Brock quickly turned her onto her side again, supporting her as she expelled the river water. "There you go," he soothed, his voice rough with relief. "Just breathe." Her blue eyes fluttered open, disoriented and filled with terror. "The wagon," she managed between coughs. "My things." "Essichich," Brock hushed her, his calloused hand awkwardly patting her shoulder. "That doesn't matter now. You're alive." Shouts echoed from upstream, and Brock spotted members of the wagon train running along the banks, pointing in their direction. A rider on horseback was already making his way toward them, leading a second mount. "Looks like your people are coming," he told her, helping her to sit up. "Can you tell me your name, Miss Katherine?" she whispered, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Katherine Zimmerman." "Miss Zimmerman," he acknowledged with a nod. "I'm Brock Parsons." She clutched at his soaked shirt suddenly, her eyes wide. "You saved my life." Something in those wide blue eyes made Brock's heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with his recent exertion. He'd pulled her from the river on instinct, but looking at her now, even soaked and bedraggled, he felt as if he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing. "Anyone would have done the same," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No," she insisted weakly. "They wouldn't." The others just watched. Her voice trailed off as she shivered violently, Brock shrugged out of his wet shirt and draped it over her shoulders, providing little warmth but some protection from the spring breeze that now felt ice-cold against their wet skin. The approaching rider reached them, dismounting quickly. "Miss Zimmerman, thank the Lord." The man looked at Brock with naked relief. "You got her out. Johnson said he saw you dive in after her. We thought you'd both been lost downstream." Brock helped Katherine to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "She needs dry clothes and warmth," he said, ignoring the man's effusive gratitude. "The river's taken most of her strength." The man nodded, introducing himself as Henry Burton, the wagon train scout. "We've set up camp just beyond that ridge. The rest decided not to attempt the crossing after your wagon went under. We'll try again tomorrow, farther upstream where it's narrower." Katherine's face crumpled at the mention of her wagon. "Everything I own was in that wagon," she whispered, and Brock felt her despair as if it were his own. "We'll see what can be salvaged," Burton assured her, though his expression suggested he held little hope. "Let's get you back to camp." Brock hesitated, suddenly reluctant to part from the woman whose life he'd just saved. He had his own destination, the small ranch he'd purchased sight unseen, 20 miles south of Julian. He'd been on his way there when he'd stopped to water his horse and witnessed the disastrous river crossing. "Mr. Parsons," Katherine said suddenly, her voice stronger than before, "will you come with us to the camp? I would like to properly thank you when I'm more composed." Burton nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir, please join us. Least we can do is offer you a hot meal and dry clothes after what you did." Decision made for him, Brock nodded, whistling sharply for his horse, which had thankfully remained nearby. "I suppose I could do with drying out," he agreed, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face. The journey back to the wagon train's camp took nearly an hour, with Katherine riding double with Burton while Brock followed on his own mount. By the time they arrived, word of the rescue had spread, and Brock found himself the reluctant center of attention as settlers gathered around, clapping him on the shoulder and offering thanks. Katherine was whisked away by two older women who fussed over her with motherly concern. Brock watched her go, an unfamiliar pang in his chest as she disappeared into a tent. A wizened old man approached, offering Brock a set of dry clothes. "They might be a bit short in the leg, but they're clean and dry," he said with a gap-toothed smile. "I'm Doc Simmons. We're all mighty grateful for what you did. That girl's been through enough already." Brock accepted the clothes with a nod of thanks. "What do you mean, she's been through enough?" the old man sighed, gesturing for Brock to follow him to a small tent where he could change. "Miss Zimmerman joined our train in St. Louis. She was traveling with her brother, but we lost him to fever in Kansas. Poor girl was determined to continue on, said they had family waiting in San Diego who didn't even know her brother had passed." He shook his head sadly. "And now this. Lost everything in that river." Brock felt a weight settle in his stomach. He knew something about loss himself, having buried his parents and younger sister back in Texas before deciding to start fresh in California. He'd spent the last 3 years working cattle drives and saving every penny to buy his own spread. Now, standing in a stranger's too small clothes, he found himself concerned with the future of a woman he'd just met. When Katherine emerged from the women's tent an hour later, she'd been transformed. Her dark hair had been dried and plaited into a simple braid, and she wore a plain brown dress that was clearly borrowed, as it hung loose on her slender frame. But it was her composed demeanor that most impressed Brock. Despite everything, she held herself with quiet dignity. She sought him out immediately, finding him seated by the main campfire where he'd been waiting. A small smile touched her lips when she saw him in the ill-fitting clothes, but there was nothing mocking in her expression, only warmth. "Mr. Parsons," she said softly, taking a seat beside him on the log that served as a bench. "I wanted to thank you properly." "You risked your life for a stranger." Brock shrugged uncomfortably. "Couldn't very well watch you drown." "Many would have," she countered. "And did." Her direct gaze unsettled him. Most women he'd known would be swooning or weeping after such an ordeal, but Katherine Zimmerman seemed made of sterner stuff. He found himself admiring her composure even as he wondered what thoughts moved behind those remarkable blue eyes. "Will you continue to San Diego?" he asked, changing the subject. A shadow crossed her face. "I don't know. My brother and I were heading there to join our uncle's shipping business." Her voice grew softer. "Robert died of fever 6 weeks ago, and now I've lost our savings, our clothes, everything." "I'm sorry about your brother," Brock said sincerely. "I lost my sister to fever as well 3 years back." Catherine's eyes met his, recognition of shared grief passing between them. "It leaves a hole nothing seems to fill," she said simply. Brock nodded, surprised by her understanding. Most people offered platitudes about time healing all wounds, but Katherine had named the empty space his sister's death had left in him with perfect accuracy. "You still have family in San Diego?" he asked. "An uncle I've never met," she admitted. "He was my father's younger brother. When father passed last year, he sent money for our passage and promised positions in his company." Her hands twisted in the borrowed skirt. "But now, I arrive as a penniless burden, not the educated assistant Robert promised I would be." Before Brock could respond, Burton approached with 2 plates of stew. "Eat up," he urged them. "We've decided to delay crossing until tomorrow. There's a ford about 3 miles upstream that should be safer." Katherine accepted the plate with murmured thanks, but Brock noticed the worry that flickered across her face. Without her wagon and possessions, how would she continue the journey? As if reading his thoughts, Burton added awkwardly, "Miss Zimmerman, we've discussed your situation. The Andersons have offered to let you ride in their wagon. We all want to help however we can, but everyone's resources are already stretched thin," she finished for him, her voice gentle with understanding. "You've all been very kind. I'll find a way to manage." After Burton left, they ate in silence for a few minutes. Brock found himself studying Katherine's profile in the firelight. She couldn't be much more than 20, yet she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone much older. Her delicate features were framed by tendrils of dark hair that had escaped her braid, and though her borrowed dress was plain, she wore it with natural grace. "I'm heading to Julian," he said suddenly, surprising himself. "I've bought a small ranch site unseen. The previous owner died without heirs, and his lawyer sold it to me by post." He cleared his throat. "Julian's a growing town. Might be work there for an educated woman." Katherine looked up from her stew, eyes widening slightly. "Are you suggesting I change my destination?" Brock shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Just offering another option. San Diego's still a rough port town in many ways. Julian's smaller, but respectable families are settling there since the gold strike. There's a school that might need a teacher, shops that need clerks." "You make a compelling case, Mr. Parsons," she said, studying him with new interest. "But I know nothing of Julian, and I have obligations to my uncle." "You could write to him from Julian," Brock suggested. "Explain what happened. If he's a decent man, he'll understand why you couldn't arrive penniless and alone." Katherine considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. "And what of accommodations? I couldn't impose on strangers." "There's a respectable boarding house for single women," Brock said, "run by a widow named Mrs. Hollister, according to the lawyer's letters. I hear she's strict but fair." "You seem to know much about a place you've never seen," Katherine observed with the ghost of a smile. Brock felt his face warm. Did my research before investing my savings. The ranch isn't much 100 acres, small house, some cattle, but it's mine. He couldn't keep the pride from his voice. Or will be once I sign the final papers. Catherine's smile grew more pronounced. It sounds wonderful, she said sincerely. They talked late into the evening, Brock sharing what he knew about Julian, its apple orchards, the recent gold discoveries that had brought prosperity to the area, the growing community of families establishing roots there. Katherine, in turn, told him about her life in St. Louis, where she'd worked as a tutor for wealthy families while caring for her ailing father. "I've never actually taught in a proper school," she admitted, warming to the idea Brock had planted, "but I've always wanted to." As the fire burned down to embers and the camp grew quiet, Katherine finally stood, stretching subtly. "I should rest. Tomorrow will bring new decisions." Brock rose as well, suddenly awkward. "Whatever you decide, I wish you well, Miss Zimmerman." She studied him for a long moment before extending her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Parsons, for everything." When their hands met, Brock felt a jolt of awareness travel up his arm. Her fingers were small but strong in his calloused grip. Something unspoken passed between them, and he found himself reluctant to let go. "Good night," she said softly, slipping her hand free and turning toward the tent where she would sleep. Brock watched her go, a strange lightness in his chest. He'd come to California seeking a fresh start, a place to build something that was his alone. He hadn't expected to find himself offering advice or perhaps more to a woman he'd pulled from a river. Yet something about Katherine Zimmerman called to him, a recognition he couldn't explain. Morning arrived with clear skies and the bustle of the wagon train preparing to move. Brock had slept poorly, his mind filled with thoughts of the woman he'd rescued and the choices that lay before her. He found her helping to prepare breakfast, moving with purpose despite her borrowed clothes and the ordeal of the previous day. She smiled when she saw him, a tentative curve of her lips that inexplicably lightened his mood. "Good morning, Mr. Parsons." "Miss Zimmerman," he replied with a tip of his hat. "How are you feeling today?" "Grateful to be breathing," she said simply. "And I've made a decision if your offer still stands." Brock raised his eyebrows in question. "I would like to travel to Julian," she said, her chin lifting slightly as if expecting argument. "I'll write to my uncle explaining what happened, but I think a fresh start might be best for now." Something like satisfaction settled in Brock's chest. "It's 2 days' ride," he warned. "The trail's not particularly difficult, but it's not a comfortable journey for a lady." Katherine's expression turned wry. "After weeks in a wagon and nearly drowning, I think I can manage a horse ride, Mr. Parsons." Burton approached them then, carrying Brock's now dry clothes from the previous day. "Thought you might want these back," he said, handing over the bundle. "We're preparing to move out in an hour. The ford should be manageable today." Brock nodded his thanks, then cleared his throat. "Miss Zimmerman has decided to change her destination to Julian. I've offered to escort her there since it's on my way." Burton looked between them, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Are you certain, Miss Zimmerman? Your uncle is expecting you." "I'll write to him," Katherine said firmly. "Under the circumstances, I think it's the wiser course." The scout nodded slowly. "Well, it's not my place to tell you your business, and traveling with Mr. Parsons is surely safer than continuing with us, given your circumstances." He hesitated. "We managed to recover a few items from downstream. Your trunk wasn't among them, I'm afraid, but we found your brother's saddlebags washed up on a sandbar." Katherine's face lit up. "Truly? Oh, thank you." The saddlebags had been her brother's pride, fine leather with his initials tooled into the flap. "Not much inside that's salvageable," Burton cautioned. "But Mrs. Anderson thought you might want them all the same. She's drying out the contents in her wagon." After Burton left, Katherine turned to Brock with more animation than he'd yet seen from her. "Those saddlebags were Robert's favorite possession," she explained, "and he kept our father's pocket watch in the inner compartment it might have survived." Her excitement was infectious, and Brock found himself smiling. "Let's go see, then." They made their way to the Andersons' wagon, where a kindly woman in her 50s was carefully laying out sodden papers and small items on a piece of canvas. "Miss Zimmerman," she exclaimed, "I've saved what I could. The papers are badly water-damaged, I'm afraid, but the watch was in a waxed leather pouch. It might need cleaning, but I think it will work again." Katherine's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the tarnished silver pocket watch. Opening it carefully, she revealed a small daguerreotype inside the cover, a family portrait of a stern-looking man, a gentle-faced woman, and 2 children. "My family," she explained softly to Brock. "Taken when Robert and I were children before Mother passed." Mrs. Anderson discreetly moved away, giving them privacy. "It's a fine likeness," Brock said, studying the tiny image. Katherine, as a child, had the same serious eyes, though her hair had been lighter then. "It's all I have left of them now," she said, closing the watch gently and slipping it into the pocket of her borrowed dress. "And these." She gestured to the saddlebags, which despite their dunking remained sturdy. "The leather's good quality," Brock observed. "They'll serve you well once they're properly dried and oiled." Katherine nodded, gathering up the few salvageable items: the watch, a small knife with a bone handle, a comb missing several teeth, and a few coins that Mrs. Anderson had cleaned. Everything else, clothing, books, personal mementos, had been lost to the river. "It's not much to start a new life with," she said pragmatically, "but it's more than many have." Her lack of self-pity impressed Brock. He'd known grown men who'd complained more over smaller losses. "If you're still determined to come to Julian, we should leave soon," he said. "I'd like to make at least 10 miles today, reach the Walker Creek crossing by nightfall." Katherine nodded decisively. "I'll say my goodbyes and thank the Andersons for their kindness." An hour later, they were ready to depart. The wagon train members had been generous with what they could spare: a canvas bag with basic provisions, a blanket, a spare shirt that one of the women had quickly altered to fit Katherine better, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the California sun. Burton had found her a gentle mare to ride, a bay with a white blaze named Penny that one of the settlers was willing to sell for a price Brock deemed fair. He paid without hesitation, waving away Katherine's protests. "Consider it an advance," he said gruffly. "You can help with the ranch accounts when we arrive. I'm no hand with figures." He wasn't sure if he was actually offering her employment or simply providing an excuse to help, but Katherine accepted with a grateful nod. "I'll repay your kindness, Mr. Parsons." They set off under the late morning sun, Katherine seated securely on Penny, her borrowed dress arranged as modestly as possible for riding astride, the saddlebags draped over the horse's rump. Brock rode beside her on his stallion, Samson, occasionally glancing over to ensure she was managing well. To his surprise, she was a competent rider, sitting the horse with natural ease despite her city upbringing. "My father believed all children should learn to ride," she explained when he commented on her skill, "though I haven't had much opportunity these past few years." They traveled steadily through the afternoon, following a trail that wound through rolling foothills covered in scrub oak and manzanita. Spring wildflowers carpeted the ground in patches of purple, yellow, and white, and the air was fragrant with sage and newly sprouted grass. The late April weather was perfect for traveling: warm days, cool nights, and clear skies. Katherine took in the scenery with evident appreciation. "It's beautiful country," she remarked as they paused to rest the horses by a small stream. "Different from what I expected of California." "Most people think of California as either San Francisco's bustling streets or the Sierra gold mines," Brock replied, helping her dismount. "But there's everything in between: deserts, mountains, valleys rich enough to grow anything. Julian's special, though, from what I hear. High enough to have 4 seasons, but sheltered enough to avoid the worst mountain weather." "You speak of it so fondly. One would think you'd lived there all your life," Katherine observed, stretching her back after the hours of riding. Brock smiled wryly. "Just hopeful, I suppose. I've been drifting since I left Texas, ready to put down roots somewhere." They shared a simple meal of jerky, hard biscuits, and dried apples, sitting companionably by the stream. Katherine removed her borrowed boots to soak her feet in the cool water, and Brock found himself noticing the delicate turn of her ankles before quickly averting his eyes. She was his traveling companion, nothing more, and he would observe the proprieties. "Tell me about your ranch," she requested as they prepared to continue their journey. "What made you choose ranching?" Brock helped her back onto Penny before mounting Samson. "I grew up on a cattle spread in West Texas," he explained as they rode. "My father ran about 300 head on land that could barely support 100. It was a hard life." He paused, memories of dust and struggle surfacing. "When fever took my mother and sister, something in my father broke. He wouldn't leave their graves, even when the drought got so bad we were losing cattle daily." Katherine rode silently beside him, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. "When he died, I sold what was left for barely enough to bury him properly," Brock continued. "Spent the next 3 years working other men's cattle, saving every penny. California seemed far enough to start fresh. And this ranch in Julian, 120 acres, according to the deed. Small cabin, barn, about 40 head of cattle, and some apple trees the previous owner planted as a side venture." Brock's voice warmed with pride. "The lawyer said there's a creek running through the north section that doesn't dry up even in summer." "It sounds wonderful," Katherine said sincerely. "A perfect place to build a future." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As the afternoon waned, Brock began looking for a suitable campsite. He eventually selected a small clearing sheltered by a stand of live oaks, with grass for the horses and a fire ring that indicated others had camped there before. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced, dismounting and moving to help Katherine from her horse. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gray in her blue eyes. She stepped back quickly, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured, turning away to busy herself with unsaddling Penny. Brock cleared his throat, moving to care for his own mount. There was something unsettling about traveling alone with Miss Zimmerman. Not that he hadn't traveled with women before. He'd escorted his sister to a school in Austin once, and he'd helped drive a wagon of mail-order brides to Abilene another time. But this felt different, more personal somehow. As twilight descended, Brock built a small fire while Katherine arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. The propriety of their sleeping arrangements hadn't been discussed, but she handled it with practical efficiency, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring they both benefited from the fire's warmth. They shared another simple meal, this time supplemented with coffee that Brock brewed in a small pot he carried in his saddlebags. The hot drink was a luxury after the long day of riding, and Katherine accepted her cup with evident gratitude. How much farther to Julian? She asked as darkness settled around them, the fire casting dancing shadows on her face. "If we make good time, We should reach it by tomorrow evening, Brock replied, leaning back against his saddle. The trail climbs more steadily tomorrow. Julian sits at about 4,000 feet. Katherine nodded, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. And what will happen when we arrive? The question hung in the air between them, layered with meaning. What indeed? Brock had acted on impulse when suggesting she accompany him to Julian, but he hadn't thought beyond their arrival. "I'll see you settled at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house," he said finally. "Then help you find employment if that's what you want. And your ranch, it's about 3 miles outside of town, close enough to visit for supplies, far enough for privacy." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said about helping with the accounts. I can pay a fair wage for bookkeeping if you're interested." Katherine studied him over the rim of her cup. "That's very generous, Mr. Parsons, but I wouldn't want charity." "It's not charity," he insisted. "I genuinely need the help, and it would be occasional work, not enough to interfere with whatever other position you find in town." She seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. I would be glad to help with your accounts." As the night deepened around them, they spoke of practical matters, the businesses in Julian, the opportunities for a woman of Katherine's education, the challenges Brock might face establishing his ranch. But beneath the practical conversation ran an undercurrent of something neither was ready to acknowledge. Katherine eventually retired to her bedroll, pulling her blanket close around her shoulders. "Good night, Mr. Parsons." "Good night, Miss Zimmerman," he replied, watching as she turned her back to the fire, her dark braid a stark line against the light blanket. Brock remained awake longer, adding wood to the fire and considering the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, he'd been a solitary traveler focused solely on reaching his new property. Now he felt responsible for this remarkable woman who'd survived tragedy and disaster with quiet dignity. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought, yet found he didn't mind. When he finally stretched out on his own bedroll, sleep came quickly, his dreams filled with rushing water and a pair of serious blue eyes. Morning dawned clear and crisp, the spring air carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of another warm day. Brock woke first, stirring up the fire and setting coffee to boil before gently rousing Katherine. She woke immediately, sitting up and quickly smoothing her braid. Despite the night spent on hard ground, she looked remarkably composed, her borrowed clothes showing only minor wrinkles. "Did you sleep well?" Brock asked, handing her a cup of coffee. "Better than expected," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Though I'm certain I'll appreciate Mrs. Hollister's beds all the more after 2 nights under the stars." They breakfasted on the last of their provisions, then broke camp efficiently. Katherine seemed determined to do her share of the work, packing her few belongings and helping to saddle the horses without complaint, despite what must have been sore muscles from the previous day's ride. As predicted, the trail climbed steadily throughout the morning, winding through increasingly forested terrain. Oak and sycamore gave way to pine and cedar as they gained elevation, and the air grew noticeably cooler. "The climate changes quickly here," Brock commented as they paused to rest the horses at midday. "Julian gets snow in winter, though it rarely lasts long. Good for the apple trees, they say." Katherine raised her face to the sun, clearly enjoying the pleasant weather. "It reminds me a little of the Ozarks, where we vacationed when I was a child. The same fresh air and sense of being above the world." They continued their journey, the trail occasionally offering spectacular views of the valleys below and distant mountains. By late afternoon, they crested a final ridge, and the town of Julian came into view, nestled in a small valley with forested hills rising beyond. Even from a distance, the town had a settled, orderly appearance that distinguished it from many Western boomtowns. Church steeples rose above sturdy wooden buildings, orchards dotted the surrounding hillsides, and neat farms occupied the flatter land. Smoke rose from chimneys despite the mild weather, and the golden light of late afternoon gave everything a prosperous glow. "It's lovely," Katherine breathed, reining Penny to a halt beside Samson. "So civilized-looking." Brock nodded, a sense of satisfaction filling him. Gold brought people here, but they stayed for the land. The mines are still producing, but many folks have turned to farming and ranching. He pointed to the northwest. "My property is beyond that far ridge." They rode into town as the sun began its descent, the main street busy with the activity of a prosperous community. A stagecoach had recently arrived, disgorging passengers in front of the hotel, while shopkeepers swept their boardwalks and children played in the dusty street before being called home for supper. People looked up with interest as Brock and Katherine rode past. Newcomers were common enough in Julian, but a woman traveling with just one male companion still attracted notice. Brock was acutely aware of the scrutiny, knowing how easily reputations could be damaged in small towns. He led the way directly to a large, two-story house set slightly back from the main street, its neat white paint and well-tended garden marking it as a place of respectability. A discreet sign hung from the porch, "Mrs. Hollister's boarding house for ladies." A stern-faced woman in her 60s appeared on the porch before they had even dismounted, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their appearance. "May I help you?" she inquired, her tone making it clear that assistance would be conditional on proper credentials. Brock removed his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Hollister, I'm Brock Parsons. I've purchased the Matthews Ranch outside of town. This is Miss Katherine Zimmerman, recently arrived from St. Louis. She's seeking accommodation while she establishes herself in Julian." Mrs. Hollister's gaze shifted to Katherine, who had dismounted and now stood straight-backed beside her horse, meeting the older woman's scrutiny with calm dignity despite her travel-worn appearance. "Miss Zimmerman," the woman acknowledged with a slight nod. "You're seeking long-term lodging." "Yes, madam," Katherine replied politely. "I hope to find employment in Julian. I'm qualified as a tutor and I have experience in bookkeeping." Mrs. Hollister's expression softened marginally. "We don't often get educated young ladies seeking independence. Most come as brides or relatives of local men." She glanced between them with sudden suspicion. "You two aren't." "Mr. Parsons rescued me from drowning during a river crossing," Katherine explained quickly. "My wagon and possessions were lost. He kindly escorted me to Julian when I decided to change my destination." Something like approval flickered across Mrs. Hollister's face. "I see. Well, I do have a room available, though I require references and a week's payment in advance." Katherine's face fell slightly. "I'm afraid the river took my letters of reference along with everything else, and my funds." She hesitated, clearly reluctant to admit her financial situation. "I'll stand as Miss Zimmerman's reference," Brock interjected firmly, "and I'll advance the first month's lodging. She'll be helping with my ranch accounts." Mrs. Hollister raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That's very generous, Mr. Parsons. Perhaps too generous for a young woman you've just met." Katherine's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but before she could speak, another voice joined the conversation. "Beatrice, you're interrogating these poor travelers before they've even had a chance to wash the trail dust off." A plump, pleasant-faced woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. "I'm Martha Collins, the town schoolteacher," she introduced herself. "And you must be the new owner of the Matthews place we've heard about." Brock nodded, grateful for the interruption. "Yes, madam. Just arrived today." Martha turned to Katherine with a warm smile. "And you, my dear, look like you've had quite a journey. Come inside and have some tea while you and Mrs. Hollister sort out the details. Mr. Parsons can see to the horses." Katherine glanced at Brock, who nodded encouragingly. "Go on. I'll bring your saddlebags once the horses are settled." With obvious relief, Katherine followed the two older women into the house. Mrs. Hollister still looked stern, but Martha's friendly presence seemed to have softened her approach somewhat. Brock led both horses to the livery stable 2 blocks away, arranging for Penny to be well cared for and Samson to be ready early the next morning. The stable owner, a garrulous man named Frank Wilson, was full of information about Julian and eager to meet the new owner of the Matthews Ranch. "Good piece of land," Wilson opined, running a professional hand over Samson's legs. "Fine horse, too." Matthews kept the place up well until the consumption took him. His foreman, Diego Martinez, has been maintaining things these past 6 months. Honest man, Martinez. You do well to keep him on. "That was my intention," Brock confirmed. "The lawyer mentioned him in our correspondence." After ensuring the horses were properly settled, Brock returned to the boarding house with Katherine's saddlebags. Martha Collins answered his knock, ushering him into a parlor where Katherine sat with Mrs. Hollister, a tea service between them. Katherine looked more relaxed, though still somewhat overwhelmed. "Ah, Mr. Parsons," Mrs. Hollister greeted him. "Miss Zimmerman has been explaining your unusual meeting. Quite dramatic." "It was," Brock agreed, placing the saddlebags beside Katherine's chair. "Has everything been arranged satisfactorily?" Katherine nodded, offering him a small smile. "Mrs. Hollister has kindly agreed to accept me as a boarder with your recommendation, and Mrs. Collins believes there may be a position at the school. We've been seeking an assistant teacher," Martha explained. "The town is growing rapidly with all the new families. Miss Zimmerman's qualifications seem perfect, though she'll need to meet with the school board, of course." "That's wonderful news," Brock said sincerely, pleased to see Katherine's prospects improving so quickly. Mrs. Hollister rose, smoothing her immaculate skirts. "I'll show Miss Zimmerman to her room now. She'll want to rest before dinner. We dine at 6 sharp, Miss Zimmerman." Katherine stood as well, turning to Brock with genuine gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Parsons. I don't know how I can repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he assured her. "I'll call tomorrow afternoon to see how you're settling in, if that's acceptable." The last was directed partly at Mrs. Hollister, who nodded with grudging approval. "That would be fine," Katherine agreed. "And perhaps we can discuss the bookkeeping arrangement." After brief farewells, Brock found himself back on the street, suddenly at loose ends. He'd been so focused on getting Katherine safely to Julian that he'd given little thought to his own arrival. Now, he needed to find his own lodging for the night before heading to the ranch in the morning. The Julian Hotel provided a clean, comfortable room and a substantial dinner. Brock spent the evening in the hotel's small saloon, where he was immediately welcomed by the locals eager to meet the new owner of the Matthews place. He fielded questions about his background and plans, learning more about his new community in the process. One name came up repeatedly: Diego Martinez, the foreman who'd kept the ranch operating after Matthews' death. Everyone spoke highly of the man, describing him as hardworking, honest, and knowledgeable about the local conditions. "You'll want to keep Martinez on," advised Edmund Bailey, the town's banker, echoing what Wilson at the livery had said. "He knows that land better than anyone. Could have bought it himself if he'd had the capital." "That was always my intention," Brock assured them. "I'll need experienced help to make the place successful." As the evening progressed, Brock found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Katherine. He hoped she was being made welcome at the boarding house, that the other residents were kind to the newcomer who'd arrived with nothing but borrowed clothes and her brother's saddlebags. He found himself looking forward to seeing her the next day, to hearing how her first night in Julian had gone. The realization that he was thinking so much about a woman he'd known for just 2 days gave him pause. He'd rescued her, escorted her to Julian, helped her find accommodation. His obligation had been fulfilled. Yet he couldn't deny the connection he felt with Katherine Zimmerman, a woman who faced adversity with quiet strength and who had trusted him enough to follow him to an unknown town. Morning found Brock eager to see his new property. After a hearty breakfast at the hotel, he collected Samson from the livery and rode out of town on the Northwest Trail. The morning was clear and cool, perfect weather for exploring his new holdings. The ranch was everything the lawyer's letters had promised and more. The main house was small but sturdy, built of local pine with a wide porch and stone chimney. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and the fenced pastures contained healthy-looking cattle. An apple orchard in neat rows occupied the south-facing slope, the trees just beginning to leaf out. Diego Martinez met him at the main corral, a lean, weathered man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and a direct manner. "Mr. Parsons," he greeted Brock, extending a hand. "Welcome to Sunrise Ranch. That's what Mr. Matthews called it, though the deed just lists it as the Matthews property." "Sunrise Ranch," Brock repeated, liking the sound of it. "It suits the place." He dismounted, shaking Martinez's hand firmly. "I've heard good things about you from everyone in town, Mr. Martinez. I hope you'll stay on as foreman." Relief crossed Martinez's face. "I would like that, sir. This place has been my home for 12 years. I know every acre." For the next several hours, Martinez showed Brock around the property, explaining the seasonal routines, the strengths and weaknesses of the operation, and introducing him to the 2 other ranch hands who lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn. Both were competent cowboys who had worked the ranch for several years and seemed pleased to learn that Martinez would remain as foreman. The house itself was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large kitchen, a parlor with a stone fireplace, and 2 bedrooms. Matthews had been a bachelor, and the house reflected his practical nature, though touches of refinement. A bookshelf filled with classics, good quality dishware, a comfortable reading chair by the window suggested he hadn't been without appreciation for life's pleasures. "It's a good place," Martinez said as they stood on the porch late that afternoon, surveying the property. "Mr. Matthews built it right, not too ambitious, not too small. A man could raise a family here and be proud." Brock nodded, already feeling at home. "That was my hope." After arranging to meet with Martinez early the next morning to discuss the spring calving and other immediate concerns, Brock rode back to town. He had promised to check on Katherine, and he found himself looking forward to sharing his impressions of the ranch with her. Mrs. Hollister's boarding house was quiet when he arrived, most of the residents apparently still at their daily occupations. A young maid answered his knock, showing him to the same formal parlor where he'd left Katherine the previous day. She arrived a few minutes later, and Brock was struck by the transformation. Gone were the borrowed clothes and trail dust. Katherine wore a simple but well-fitted blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her dark hair neatly arranged in a coil at the nape of her neck. She looked rested and composed, though she still carried herself with the wariness of someone in unfamiliar surroundings. "Mr. Parsons," she greeted him with a genuine smile. "How good of you to call." "Miss Zimmerman," he replied, rising from his chair. "You look well." "Julian seems to agree with you." She laughed softly, taking a seat across from him. "A proper bed and bath work wonders, it seems. Mrs. Hollister has been very kind, lending me this dress until I can purchase my own things. Has Mrs. Collins spoken further about the teaching position? Katherine nodded, her expression brightening. I'm to meet with the school board tomorrow. Mrs. Collins is quite confident they'll approve my appointment, especially since student numbers have increased so dramatically this spring. That's excellent news, Brock said sincerely. And have you had a chance to explore the town? A little. Mrs. Hollister took me to the mercantile this morning to arrange for some basic necessities. The owner, Mr. Jenkins, was kind enough to extend credit based on the promise of my teaching position. She hesitated, then added, I also visited the bank to inquire about sending a letter to my uncle in San Diego. They'll include it with their regular correspondence tomorrow. You've been busy, Brock observed with approval. What did you tell your uncle? A shadow crossed Katherine's face. The truth. That I lost Robert, then nearly lost my own life in the river crossing. That I've found a potential position in Julian and will contact him again when I'm more settled. She sighed softly. I hated to disappoint him, but I can't arrive in San Diego as a penniless burden. He'll understand, Brock assured her. Family should. Their conversation turned to Brock's first impressions of his ranch. Katherine listened with genuine interest as he described the property, asking insightful questions about the operation and his plans for the future. It sounds wonderful, she said when he'd finished. A solid foundation to build upon. It is, he agreed. Martinez has done an excellent job maintaining things. He explained the bookkeeping system Matthews used, but I'll admit it's more complex than I'm accustomed to. That's where I hoped you might help. Katherine nodded eagerly. I'd be glad to. My father was meticulous about his accounts, and he taught Robert and me the same habits. When would you like me to start? They arranged for Katherine to visit the ranch on Saturday, 3 days hence, assuming her teaching appointment was confirmed. Mrs. Hollister had strict rules about young ladies traveling unchaperoned, but Martha Collins had offered to accompany Katherine on her first visit to the ranch. As their conversation drew to a close, Brock found himself reluctant to leave. There was something refreshing about Katherine's company, her practical intelligence, her resilience, the quiet dignity with which she faced her changed circumstances. I should let you return to your preparations for tomorrow, he said finally, rising from his chair. I wish you success with the school board. Katherine walked with him to the door, pausing on the threshold. Thank you again, Mr. Parsons, for everything. I'm beginning to think that river crossing, as frightening as it was, may have been a blessing in disguise. Their eyes met, and Brock felt that same inexplicable connection he'd experienced by the campfire. Perhaps it was, he agreed quietly. The next 3 days passed quickly for both of them. Brock settled into the rhythms of the ranch, working alongside Martinez and the other hands to familiarize himself with every aspect of the operation. Katherine, meanwhile, secured her position at the school, impressing the board with her education and composed manner. She would begin teaching the younger students the following Monday, allowing the overcrowded school to expand its offerings. By the time Saturday arrived, Brock realized he was anticipating Katherine's visit with unusual eagerness. He spent the morning ensuring the house was presentable, even cutting a small bunch of wildflowers for the kitchen table, an act that earned knowing glances from Martinez. Katherine arrived promptly at noon, accompanied by Martha Collins. Brock greeted them at the gate, helping them down from the small buggy Martha had borrowed for the occasion. Welcome to Sunrise Ranch, he said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. I hope the drive wasn't too dusty. Not at all, Martha assured him, looking around with approval. Samuel Matthews built a fine place here. It's good to see it occupied again. Katherine said little at first, taking in the ranch with obvious interest. Her blue dress, one of two she'd managed to have made in town, already suited her perfectly, and the wide-brimmed hat she wore to protect her fair skin from the California sun lent her an unexpectedly sophisticated air. Brock offered them a tour, showing them the house, barn, and nearby orchard. Martha commented knowledgeably on various features, having known the property during Matthew's lifetime, while Katherine observed everything with thoughtful attention. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely when they returned to the house for the simple lunch Brock had prepared. "You can feel how well loved this place has been." After they ate, Martha tactfully suggested she might visit with Martinez's wife, Maria, who lived in a small house beyond the orchard. "She makes the most extraordinary quilts," Martha explained. "I've been meaning to commission one for ages." This left Brock and Katherine alone to review the ranch accounts, though the parlor door remained conspicuously open in deference to propriety. Brock brought out the ledgers Matthews had kept, explaining what he understood of the system. Katherine proved to be as knowledgeable about bookkeeping as she'd claimed. She quickly grasped the organization of the accounts, making helpful suggestions for small improvements while respecting the existing system. "Matthews was thorough," she commented, turning pages of neat figures. "That will make the transition much easier for you. Everything is well-documented: expenses, income, breeding records for the cattle, even yields from the apple orchard." For over an hour, they worked companionably at the parlor table, Katherine explaining various accounting practices, while Brock contributed his knowledge of ranch operations. By the time Martha returned, they had established a clear plan for maintaining the books going forward, with Katherine visiting one Saturday each month to review the accounts. "This has been most productive," Katherine said as they prepared to leave, carefully stacking the ledgers. "I'll prepare a summary of the yearly cycle based on the previous records, which should help you anticipate expenses and income." "I appreciate your help more than I can say," Brock told her sincerely. "Ranching I understand, but these figures—" He shook his head ruefully. "My father kept his accounts on the back of feed sacks, and even those occasionally blew away in the Texas wind." Katherine laughed, the sound unexpectedly musical. "Well, we'll ensure your records are more permanent. A successful ranch depends on good management as much as hard work." As he helped the women into the buggy, Brock found himself making an impulsive decision. "Miss Zimmerman, would you allow me to escort you to church tomorrow? I understand most of the town attends the Sunday service." A faint blush colored Katherine's cheeks. "I would like that very much, Mr. Parsons." Martha beamed approval from her seat. "Excellent. The whole town will be there. It's a good way to establish yourself as part of the community, Mr. Parsons." As the buggy pulled away, Brock stood watching until it disappeared around a bend in the road. He was unexpectedly pleased by the prospect of seeing Katherine again so soon, a feeling that both confused and intrigued him. Martinez approached, having observed the departure from the barn. "Miss Zimmerman seems a sensible lady," he commented, his expression carefully neutral. "She is," Brock agreed, wondering at the knowing look in his foreman's eyes. "Very capable with figures." Martinez merely nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, senor." The figures. The following morning, Brock dressed with unusual care in his one good suit, riding into town with plenty of time to collect Katherine. Mrs. Hollister answered his knock, giving him a critical once-over before nodding with grudging approval and calling for Katherine. When she appeared, Brock found himself momentarily speechless. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her dark hair and fair skin perfectly, with a matching bonnet tied beneath her chin. Simple pearl earrings borrowed from another boarder, she would later tell him were her only adornment, but she carried herself with such natural grace that she needed nothing more. "Good morning, Mr. Parsons," she greeted him with a smile. "You look very distinguished today." "And you look beautiful, Miss Zimmerman," he replied honestly, offering his arm. The Julian Community Church was a simple white clapboard building with a tall steeple, set on a slight rise at the edge of town. By the time Brock and Katherine arrived, most of the town's residents were already gathered on the steps and lawn, the Sunday service providing both spiritual guidance and social connection for the community. Their arrival together attracted notice, though the townspeople were too well-mannered to comment openly. Martha Collins came forward to introduce them to those Katherine hadn't yet met, including the minister, Reverend Thomas Baker, and his wife Sarah. "We're delighted to welcome both of you to Julian," Reverend Baker said warmly. "I understand you've already secured a position with the school, Miss Zimmerman. The children will benefit greatly from your experience." Throughout the service, Brock was acutely aware of Katherine beside him in the pew they shared with Martha and Edmund Bailey, the banker. Katherine sang the hymns in a pleasant contralto, followed the prayers with evident sincerity, and listened attentively to the sermon. Brock found his attention divided between the service and the woman beside him, struck by how naturally she seemed to fit into the life of Julian already. After the service, they joined the congregation for the traditional social hour on the church lawn. Katherine was quickly drawn into conversation with several of the town's women, who were eager to welcome the new teacher, while Brock found himself discussing cattle prices with a group of local ranchers. "Miss Zimmerman seems to be settling in well," observed Edmund Bailey, who had joined their circle. "A fortunate outcome from what could have been a terrible tragedy." Brock nodded, his eyes finding Katherine across the lawn. She was engaged in animated conversation with Sarah Baker and several other women, smiling at something one had said. "She's remarkably resilient." "And remarkably lovely," added Henry Jenkins, the mercantile owner, with a knowing glance at Brock. "Half the unmarried men in town have already found reasons to visit the school this week." Brock felt an unexpected twinge of something that might have been jealousy. "She's focused on establishing herself professionally," he said more curtly than he'd intended. Bailey and Jenkins exchanged amused glances, but tactfully changed the subject to the spring cattle prices. When it came time to leave, Brock escorted Katherine back to the boarding house, their walk slowed by frequent stops to speak with townspeople. By the time they reached Mrs. Hollister's front gate, Brock felt as if they'd spoken with half the population of Julian. "I didn't realize how exhausting socializing could be," Katherine admitted with a small laugh as they paused at the gate, "though everyone has been remarkably welcoming." "Julian prides itself on being a civilized community," Brock replied. "Not like some of the rougher mining towns." Katherine's expression grew thoughtful. "I think I made the right decision coming here instead of continuing to San Diego. There's something about this town that feels right." She glanced up at him, her blue eyes sincere. "Thank you again for suggesting it." "I'm glad it's working out for you," Brock said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the delicate scent of lavender that seemed to surround her. "Would you, that is, might I call on you again?" "Perhaps next Sunday." A smile bloomed on her face, genuine and unguarded. "I would like that very much, Mr. Parsons." As he rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Brock found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. 2 weeks ago, he had been a solitary traveler with no connections and no responsibilities beyond himself and his newly purchased ranch. Now he found himself thinking constantly of a woman he'd pulled from a river, a woman whose quiet strength and dignity had somehow worked their way into his consciousness. The next month passed in a blur of activity for both of them. Brock threw himself into spring ranch work, branding calves, mending fences, preparing the orchard for the coming growing season. Katherine, meanwhile, established herself at the school, quickly becoming a favorite with her young students and earning the respect of their parents. They saw each other regularly at church each Sunday, occasional dinners at the hotel with other townspeople, and Katherine's monthly visit to the ranch to help with the accounts. A pattern developed naturally, with Brock calling at the boarding house every Sunday to escort Katherine to church, followed by lunch at the hotel. These meetings were always conducted with perfect propriety, usually in the company of others. Yet Brock found himself increasingly drawn to Katherine's intelligence, her quiet humor, and the grace with which she handled every situation. For her part, Katherine seemed to welcome his company, her initial reserve gradually giving way to a more open warmth when they were together. By early June, Brock found himself contemplating a step he had never expected to take so soon after establishing his ranch. The apple trees were in full bloom, filling the orchard with fragrant white blossoms, when he approached Martinez with a question about the small clearing on the east side of the property. Could a house be built there? He asked, trying to sound casual. Something suitable for a family. Martinez gave him a knowing look. The soil is good, the view is fine, and it's sheltered from the worst winter winds, he replied. A man could do worse for a home site. He paused, then added carefully, for when he might have a wife and children. Brock nodded, not bothering to deny his thoughts. How soon could such a house be ready? Before winter, perhaps? With good help and fair weather, a solid house could be framed and closed in before the first snow, Martinez confirmed. Though the finishing might take longer, the conversation left Brock with much to consider. He had known Katherine for barely 2 months. Was he truly contemplating marriage to a woman he was only beginning to know? Yet in his heart, he felt a certainty that surprised him. Katherine Zimmerman was unlike any woman he had ever met, intelligent, capable, resilient, and possessed of a quiet dignity that commanded respect. But did she feel the same? Their interactions, while warm, had remained strictly proper. Katherine had given no clear indication that she saw him as anything more than a kind benefactor and friend, and she was finally establishing her independence after significant hardship. Would she welcome a proposal, or see it as another disruption to her carefully reconstructed life? These thoughts occupied Brock as he rode into town for their usual Sunday meeting the following week. Katherine seemed distracted during the church service, and when they walked to the hotel for lunch afterward, she was unusually quiet. "Is something troubling you?" Brock finally asked as they were seated at their usual table. Katherine hesitated, then reached into her reticule and withdrew a letter. "This arrived yesterday from my uncle in San Diego. He wishes me to reconsider my decision to remain in Julian." Brock felt his heart sink. "I see. Does he give reasons?" "He has secured a position for me with a prestigious family as a governess to their children. The salary is quite generous." She folded the letter carefully. "He means well. He worries that a small town like Julian offers limited prospects for a woman alone." "And what do you think?" Brock asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Katherine was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the folded letter. "I've come to love Julian," she said finally, meeting his eyes. "The school, the children, the community. I've found something here I never expected." Relief washed over Brock. "Then you'll stay?" "I believe I will, yes." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Unless there's a reason I shouldn't." Something in her tone made Brock's pulse quicken. Was she asking for reassurance, perhaps even encouragement to remain? Before he could formulate a response, They were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend and Mrs. Baker, who joined them at their table as had become customary on these Sunday lunches. The moment passed, but Brock felt a new resolve forming. If Katherine was truly considering her future in Julian, he needed to make his intentions clear before she made any final decisions. The opportunity came the following Saturday, when Katherine made her monthly visit to review the ranch accounts. Martha Collins, her usual chaperone, had been called away to care for her ailing sister in San Bernardino, but Mrs. Hollister had permitted the visit on the condition that Maria Martinez would be present at the house. The June day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and ripening grass. Brock met Katherine at the gate, helping her down from the small buggy she had rented from the livery. "The ranch looks wonderful," she commented as they walked toward the house. "Everything's so green and vibrant." "June is a good month here," Brock agreed, noticing how the sunlight brought out auburn highlights in her dark hair. "Before the summer heat really takes hold." They worked on the accounts for over an hour, with Maria Martinez discreetly busy in the kitchen nearby. When they had finished, Brock suggested a walk to see the orchard, now past its blossoming stage but heavy with small, developing fruit. "Martinez says it should be a good crop this year," he explained as they strolled between the neat rows of trees. The previous owner started with just 10 trees, but he added more each year. "There are 40 now, with room for 20 more." Katherine reached up to touch a small green apple, still months from ripening. "Building something that takes years to reach its potential, there's something very hopeful about that." "That's how I feel about this entire ranch," Brock admitted. "It's not just about the present but what it could become over time, with the right care, the right partnership." They had reached the eastern edge of the orchard, where the small clearing Brock had discussed with Martinez opened before them. The site overlooked a gentle valley with the distant mountains beyond, wildflowers dotting the grass in patches of yellow and purple. Katherine paused, taking in the view. "It's beautiful here." "I've been thinking of building a house on this spot," Brock said, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. "Something larger than the current house, more suitable for a family." She turned to him, her blue eyes questioning. "A family?" Brock took a deep breath. "Katherine, I know we haven't known each other very long and I don't wish to presume, but these past months I've come to admire you more than I can express. Your strength, your intelligence, your kindness." Her eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I never expected to meet someone like you," he continued, taking her hands in his. "Certainly not by pulling you from a river." That earned a small smile, encouraging him. "But now I can't imagine my future without you in it. I'm asking if you might consider building that future together." "As my wife." For a long moment Katherine was silent, her expression unreadable. Brock felt his confidence wavering. Had he misread her feelings? Moved too quickly? "I should tell you," she finally said, her voice soft but steady, "that I came to California seeking independence. After losing my father and brother, after having to depend on the charity of others, I wanted to prove I could stand on my own." Brock's heart sank, but he nodded. "I understand, and I respect your need for independence. Let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I came seeking independence, but what I found was something different, something better." Her hands tightened on his. "I found you, Brock. Someone who respected my capabilities even while offering help. Someone who saw me as a full person, not just a woman in need of rescue." Hope flickered in Brock's chest. "Does that mean?" A radiant smile spread across Katherine's face. "Yes, Brock Parsons, I would be honored to be your wife, to build a future here together." Joy unlike anything he'd ever known surged through Brock. Without thinking, He pulled Katherine into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. Her laughter, bright and unrestrained, was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. When he set her down, they were both breathless. Propriety forgotten, Brock cupped her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you, Katherine Zimmerman?" Her answer was to rise on her toes, meeting his lips with her own in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, expressing all the feelings that had grown between them since that fateful day at the river crossing. When they finally parted, Katherine's eyes were shining. "I believe Mrs. Martinez is watching us from the kitchen window," she whispered, a hint of mischief in her voice. Brock glanced toward the house to see a curtain falling hastily back into place. "I suppose we should return and share our news," he said, reluctant to end this perfect moment. Katherine nodded, smoothing her skirts with slightly trembling hands. "Mrs. Hollister will need to be informed, and Reverend Baker." A shadow crossed her face. "I have no family to stand with me, Brock. No father to give his blessing." "You have me," Brock said firmly, taking her hand. "And soon you'll have all of Julian. They've already taken you to their hearts." They walked back to the house hand in hand, both aware that they were crossing a threshold into a new chapter of their lives. Maria greeted them with knowing eyes and warm congratulations, insisting on preparing a special dinner to celebrate the engagement. The news spread quickly through Julian. By Sunday morning, when Brock and Katherine arrived at church together, the entire town seemed aware of their engagement. They were surrounded by well-wishers after the service, the community genuinely delighted by the union of the new rancher and the schoolteacher. Mrs. Hollister, who had initially been skeptical of Katherine's connection to Brock, became unexpectedly enthusiastic about the wedding plans. "It's not every day one of my girls makes such a suitable match," she declared, taking charge of the arrangements with military precision. The wedding was set for early September, before the apple harvest would demand Brock's full attention, and after the school term had begun, allowing Katherine's students to attend the ceremony. In the meantime, construction began on the new house, with Martinez supervising a crew of local carpenters while Brock divided his time between ranch work and building his future home. Katherine continued teaching through the summer session, using her evenings to prepare for her new role as a rancher's wife. Mrs. Martinez and several other ranch wives proved invaluable, sharing their knowledge of gardening, food preservation, and household management specific to ranch life. Through it all, Brock and Katherine's bond deepened. Their Sunday outings expanded to include picnics by the creek that ran through the ranch property, rides to explore the surrounding countryside, and quiet evenings on the porch of the old house, planning their future together. "Did you ever imagine," Katherine asked one evening as they watched the sunset from the porch, "that pulling a drowning woman from a river would lead to this?" Brock took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold engagement ring he'd purchased from the jeweler in San Diego. "I knew the moment you opened your eyes on that riverbank that something had changed," he admitted. "I just didn't know how completely you would change my life." Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so focused on what I'd lost that day, my possessions, my plans. I couldn't see what I'd gained." "And what was that?" Brock asked softly. She turned to face him, her blue eyes reflecting the last golden light of day. "You. A new direction. A home that feels more right than anywhere I've ever been." Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the September air carrying the first hint of autumn crispness. The entire town of Julian seemed to have turned out for the occasion, the small church filled to capacity with well-wishers. Katherine wore a gown of ivory silk, ordered from San Diego with Mrs. Hollister's assistance. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant coil, adorned with small white flowers from the ranch's garden. In the absence of family, Martha Collins stood with her as matron of honor, while Reverend Baker had arranged for Edmund Bailey to escort her down the aisle. When the church doors opened and Katherine appeared, Brock felt his heart stop, then resume at a thunderous pace. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness as she moved toward him with measured steps. Every hardship they had faced her near drowning, the loss of her possessions. His years of solitary struggle seemed to fade into insignificance against the perfect rightness of this moment. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, their voices steady as they promised to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever the future might bring. When Reverend Baker pronounced them husband and wife, Brock kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the strength of his feelings, aware even in this most personal moment of the smiling witnesses surrounding them. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and relaxed, with food contributed by half the households in Julian and music provided by local musicians. Katherine danced first with her husband, then with many of the town's leading citizens, her face alight with happiness throughout. "She belongs here," Martha Collins observed to Brock as they watched Katherine laughing with a group of her students, as if she was always meant to find Julian. "I think she was," Brock agreed, his chest tight with emotion, "just as I was meant to be at that river crossing." As the evening drew to a close, the couple departed amid cheers and well wishes, riding in a flower-decorated buggy to their new home. Though not completely finished, some interior details would wait until after the apple harvest. The house was ready for occupancy, with basic furnishings and the essentials for starting their life together. Brock lifted Katherine over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Inside, the main room was warm and welcoming, with a fire burning in the new stone fireplace and a simple supper laid out on the table, courtesy of Maria Martinez. "Welcome home, Mrs. Parsons," Brock said softly, setting his bride on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Katherine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked around the home they would share. "It's perfect, Brock. Everything I could have wished for." Later that night, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, Katherine lay in her husband's arms, her head resting on his chest. "Do you think we'll ever forget how we met?" she asked drowsily. Brock's arms tightened around her. "I hope not. Every time I look at the river, I'll remember finding the greatest treasure of my life." Katherine raised her head, her expression suddenly serious. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life that day." "You did," Brock insisted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Every day since, with your strength and your love." She kissed him then, a kiss that spoke of gratitude and love, of promises kept, and a future unfolding before them as vast and hopeful as the California sky. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Parsons Ranch. Their first child, a son they named Robert after Katherine's brother, arrived the following summer, his birth coinciding with the most bountiful apple harvest in the ranch's history. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined the family 2 years later, followed by another son, Thomas, the year after that. Katherine balanced motherhood with continued involvement in the community, serving on the school board and occasionally substituting when teachers were needed. Brock expanded the ranch operations gradually, adding more cattle and increasing the apple orchard, until Parsons' Sunrise apples became known throughout Southern California for their quality. Julian grew alongside the Parsons family, developing into a prosperous community known for its mines, orchards, and quality of life. The river crossing that had nearly claimed Katherine's life was eventually replaced by a sturdy bridge, though Brock and Katherine always paused when passing it, remembering the day that had changed both their lives so dramatically. On their 10th anniversary, they took their children on a picnic to the spot where Brock had proposed. The apple trees were heavy with ripening fruit, the small clearing now occupied by a gazebo Katherine had requested as an anniversary gift years earlier. As the children played nearby under Maria Martinez's watchful eye, Brock took his wife's hand, marveling at how the years had only enhanced her beauty. "Any regrets, Mrs. Parsons, about the path your life has taken?" Katherine looked around at the thriving ranch, at their children's laughing faces, then back to the man who had pulled her from the river so long ago. "Not one," she said firmly. "Every current brought me exactly where I needed to be." Brock kissed her then, as tenderly as he had on their wedding day, knowing with absolute certainty that the impulsive dive into a swollen river had been the most important moment of his life, the moment that had brought him not just Katherine, but the family, home, and happiness he'd never dared to imagine could be his. And on warm spring evenings for many years to come, the Parsons would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, their hands clasped together as they savored the life they had built from that fateful crossing, that desperate rescue, and the love that had grown between a drowning woman and the cowboy who had refused to let her go.